after several weeks of having fun around touring southwestern England, a little trip over to Paris, and several local races in which Dorade did very well, we got together and arranged to get into the Fastnet race, which is the British premier ocean racing event, an annual affair, usually with some very heavy winds, sometimes storms. So here we are now down at Cowes on the Isle of Wight, across from Southampton. That's a picture of the English Channel in one of its very milder moods. And the fleet is anchored, that's the old Leviathan going out. And some of the boats here that's the Highland Light, now ready for a shot at this race after not winning the other one. And the big cutter called Alexia, that's the Martinis again. And there are several smaller boats that I didn't have the names on, but we all were just the Mistress up there. Not all the American boats went in. The Amberjack, a little American schooner, was in the ocean race. She was the smallest boat in the race, incidentally. And that's the Ilex again, sailed by the British engineers. And some very pretty boats. But in the with no wind practically, and it's quite a strong tide out there. As you see, many of the boats were just hanging, and so in order to avoid being swept too far away from the starting line, we had to throw an anchor overboard, and most of the boats did. There's the Amaryllis, a character boat if there ever was one, and apparently an old-timer at this particular race. Going into the Fastnet race was one of the main objectives of having the American boats race over in the transatlantic race in the first place. And as it turns out, Dorade did very well in that. And as you will see, we had some pretty heavy weather. We had two more on the crew. Briggs Cunningham, who was an American who was over in England racing 6 meters, and a commander from the British Navy, the old Navy, had been a commander of a minesweeper during the war, and Olin thought he would be a help in identifying our navigational problems along some of the coast of England before we went out. This was a race going from Cowes again down past the end of England, down around the head there and Land's End, and out across the Irish Sea and across and around the Fastnet Rock, which is a big lighthouse on top of a very tall rock off the coast of Ireland, and then back to Plymouth. So here we are, cruising along slowly down the channel, boats changing places as the puffs of wind come in. And then gradually the breeze did come in, and things began to get serious, so to speak. That's the Jolie Breeze, big, heavy English, an old pilot boat, doing very well in the light breeze. The American, all but 2 of the American boats, I think, went in this Fastnet race. There were about 38 boats, I think, altogether. And of course, this was not a long race. Really about 3 days or so, close to 550 miles. But very tough going. That's a little experimental boat with the name Uffa Fox, who no relative, but a very much of a research man in yacht racing. And you can see a little breeze coming along behind us there. There's the Highland Light ahead of us again. for a time. There were reports, there's some 12 meters out there racing, and then you see the fleet is changing position a bit as the breeze comes in. The cook was prepared for a hard time. This is a kind of race where you just kind of felt you didn't get much sleep, you didn't get too much food, and just tried to keep the boat going. So this was not a good omen, having the wind so flat. Now we've passed the Highland Light, and there's a big English cutter, Patience. She and the Highland Light were two scratch boats in this race, and they had to allow us quite a bit of time. That's the King's cutter, the big Britannia, big J-boats out sailing. And incidentally, speaking of royalty, we had a visit from King Alfonso of Spain, who had just abdicated at that time, had his yacht in at Cowes for race week, and actually came aboard Dorade and had a nice visit. Very charming fellow, and quite interested in the whole affair. The old schooner Westward that was finally brought over here and formed the first vessel for the Sea Education Association down here on Cape Cod. But the breeze is now coming up, and the boats are sharpening up. We're close haul going up the end of the channel. I think that's a French designed cutter, and here is a picture of what we call a bone in the teeth. On track again, there's Jolie Breeze, and would you like to be out on the end of that bowsprit with 4 to 6 foot waves coming at you, trying to get that sail in? So those were, that crew was the old example of wooden ships and iron men. Now we're off Land's End again and beginning to round up and head into the Irish Sea. These fishermen came out alongside and gave us some information, and that's looking in toward the rocks and reefs off the end of the English coast. A very placid night, and nice sailing during this day. But then the breeze came around a little bit later and got behind us, and we were sailing along well, but with gathering clouds, and didn't look too good. And the breeze kept coming in all that day, the second day, and by evening, you see, we were moving along in pretty good shape, and things were moving in behind us. And lo and behold, there's the Highland Light again. Now she's behind us for a while, but catching up pretty fast. A beautiful sight with that huge spinnaker out, pulling her, lifting up, riding over on top of that sea, and then plowing down and just moving along. As it turned out, we went all night. There she is, still coming up close. And at night, we somehow managed to get ahead again, and were just a little bit behind the schooner Water Gypsy at the Fastnet Rock this next morning, when it really was blowing pretty hard. The wind came around again a bit ahead, and we had to harden up. Everybody in the cockpit just going along. Dorade again, as she had, carried full mainsail all the way across the ocean, and still had it. We didn't have to reef down at all. We came pretty close a couple of times, but didn't do it. So our main effort, of course, was to get up and around the Fastnet Rock, and we didn't know quite where we stood, but we saw, you will see, if you can see it in a minute, up in the left-hand part of the picture, that's the Fastnet Rock there. And at times, in a real rough weather, the waves apparently get up right to the base of that tower. And they tell me it's quite a sight. The schooner Water Gypsy had been sailing very well all night, and she was up just perhaps a half hour or so ahead of us, going around the light. Can't quite spot her yet, but she's up there somewhere. And so we rounded up, got around the light. There she is, showing up in the left-hand corner a bit. Doesn't matter much because she stayed ahead of us. And as we went back, we got some breeze behind us, but the wind began increasing and got up in the 40s, blowing quite hard on a nasty sea. There's Rod, and there's Briggs Cunningham and Olin, and the English Navy man, a couple of the crew members in the cockpit again. We were sailing pretty close, but not too tight, so we weren't getting too wet. Dorade was behaving very well, as usual. And then as we went, the breeze eased up a little bit, and we started back down the channel. But then, almost as we got into the channel, it began to breeze up again and got up into the 40s and was increasing. And turns out that as the other boats were quite well behind us, the breeze apparently it turned into a real storm, and the breeze up on the hoe, Drake's hoe, showed up about 90 miles an hour at one point. The boats that were still out there took a terrible beating. A couple of them had to withdraw, and unfortunately one of the men on one of the British boats was washed overboard from the stern of the boat. But in short, we got home safely, and while we were beaten boat for boat by both the Patience and Highland Light, and then later the Water Gypsy, we still saved our time allowance by quite a lot. So Dorade again walked off with the first prize. A great compliment to Olin and Rod and the boat. Now we're going in our last sail, actually, in England. That's a place called the Needles, a famous photographic spot over on the Isle of Wight. We're sailing down to go into Southampton and put the boat on a steamer, the old White Star Liner Homerick, to come home because it was pretty late. It was getting into the end of August, and everybody had to be home ahead of time for school and college and so forth. So we're having and enjoying a nice sail down along the coast and into Southampton. So between the Atlantic race and the several races in and around English waters, and then the Fastnet race, it was quite a wonderful season for Dorade and the crew. And we had just a beautiful time, plenty to eat, generally good sleep, and Dorade just showed off beautifully. So we got the boat into Southampton with the sunset behind us, and took the masts out, of course, and then decided to take it easy and have a nice trip home.